This event, the last one in here today, I understand. My name is Rian Kelly and I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer at National Grid, and I'm delighted to be chairing and moderating the panel today and to have you in the audience to listen to the presentations. I've got a few opening comments and then I will hand over, and I think each of the panel is going to do a presentation, and we may take some questions at the end, but we'll see how we go. So just a couple of comments from me to open us up, that there will be no transition without transmission. I can thank Marcus Stewart for that sentence, but I quite liked it and I think it's true. Of course, the expansion of electricity grids are going to be absolutely essential for delivering net zero, for integrating more renewables, for reducing costs, enhancing energy security and increasing energy access globally. I'm delighted that the UK is taking a lead in this, and in partnership with India has set up the Green Grids Initiative, One Sun, One World, One Grid, the snappy acronym of OSIWOG. It was launched at COP26. It has the backing of over 90 countries, and it's very much focused on how to build up and operate electricity grids that can absorb a larger share of renewable energy. The OSIWOG, what it does best is has created an ecosystem of actors. So it includes government, finance, regulators, and the private sector. And it's really a conduit to investment and assistance to accelerate the deployment of electricity grids globally. Since its launch last year, it's advanced projects that can deliver transmission change. I know the team were at the Global Clean Energy Action Forum in Pittsburgh, and were able to sort of list a few of the achievements from the first year. So energy corridors in Africa, development of principles and a blueprint to support greater interconnection projects, particularly in ASEAN, and then developing knowledge sharing platforms for the small island developing states to add to their grid, to support their grid challenges. I think one of the things we definitely think at National Grid, and I hope has come across at COP27, is that although we have a current energy crisis, it's now more important than ever that we accelerate and urgently work together to accelerate the shift to clean power generation and zero carbon economies, and that we wean ourselves off fossil fuel. And in that sense, the GGI OSIWOG has a really important role in strengthening international collaboration around green grids. So what I'm going to do is ask each of our brilliant panelists to come up. They've got slides. I'm going to suggest they introduce themselves and then walk you through their slides. And as I say, if we have questions at the end, we'll take them. But Mark, do you want to step up first?
I have to admit that I've not memorized my slides, so I'm going to get a bit of whiplash just looking over my shoulder to have a look at them. My name is Mark Howells. I am a professor from Imperial College and Loughborough University, and head up something called the Climate Compatible Growth Program, which is an FCDO-funded program and includes the universities of the Open University, KTH in Sweden, Loughborough, Imperial, UCL, Oxford and Cambridge, and we work a lot in partnership with a number of international organizations. This particular piece draws from some work that we're doing that looks at the financing of grid investments, and we'll see in a minute why this is critically important. So as Marcus said, there is no transition without transmission. So getting the funding into that transmission is important. And just why is that the case? Well, if we were to take Africa, for example, we're in the Africa COP right now. We have countries with absolutely enormous renewable energy potentials in some parts of the continent, and other parts of the continent with very large demands. And if we believe the energy transition is going to take place, there will be an incredible escalation in mining demand throughout Africa. That requires energy, and if we want the goods, the materials that we're using for this transition in different parts of the world, as well as Africa, to have low embodied emissions, it's important to get bulk, clean electricity to those consumers. And there are sort of two options. One is to use your domestic resources, and another is to pull from the very large resources that might be in place with some of your neighbors. At the same time, we need grids in order to be able to do balancing sensibly. Hydropower in Africa is particularly important. In one part of Africa right now, we have an extended drought. In other river basins, we do not have that. And if there was a capacity to move power across, that would free up a lot. Similarly, we have places where there are large renewable energy potentials. We think about the deserts in Namibia and elsewhere across Africa. You know, if those could be brought into a system that could be balanced by hydro, as has been done for decades in the Nordics, with Denmark with wind and Norway with hydro, you have a really low-cost, clean system. And just bear in mind, demands in Africa are going to be skyrocketing. So there's an imperative to be able to do this and set it up sensibly. Next slide, please. So just by way of introduction, I think the big thing that I want you to take away from this slide is that there is something like $300 billion worth of investment that needs to take place in grids by 2030 to meet some of our demands going forward under a business as usual scenario. Okay, we have a large model that I'll talk about shortly, and we work together with the International Energy Agency to unpack this. But the investment in grids is significant. Growth is significant, and the way we're doing things at the moment, we are lagging behind. We simply don't have the capacity to roll this out fast enough, and finance is important. Next slide, please. This is a particularly interesting graphic. It comes from a paper that we produced with a set of partners in the Green Grids Initiative and a finance group. And these included various multinational development banks, the Green Climate Fund, and others. And we had a look at the rules for financing grids. So we know that investing in grids is needed to unlock large renewable energy capacities and clean energy capacities. We know that. But if we were to apply the rules that are applied right now for the release of financing for grids, what we estimate is something like only 40% of the grid capacity that we need by 2030 will in fact be eligible for climate funding. And we'll see why in just a minute. So we'll go into the next slide, please. Yeah, and this is it. So let's take a couple of African countries. Just as an example, many of those will the proportion of their electricity generation will come from fossil fuels for various reasons. I mean, these supply relatively reliable baseload power. They're relatively easy to finance and so on and set up. I mean, it's the story of the West. Just go back a little bit and it's the same. So this is there. Now, if you invest in these grids, it's possible then that you can increase the investment in renewable capacity in those countries, but you're starting from a high fossil fuel base. Now, many of the rules that exist around releasing funding for grids they're all about the carbon intensity of the countries that they're connecting up. So while a grid can release large amounts of renewable investment by matching a place with large potential, with large demand, if right now that the current generation is fossil dominated and the demand on the other side is fossil dominated, you will not be able to qualify for some of the funds. You will not get through the criteria that many of the lenders use to release funds at the moment, okay? And this is really important. So you can have a really ambitious low carbon investment trajectory, but if your grid intensity, the carbon intensity of your grid right now is high, it means that you will not get access to funds. And there are a couple of really important sets of criteria out there. There's the EU taxonomy, which uses this grid intensity as the measure for whether or not you release funds. And then there's another piece that's used by the MDBs called the common principles. The common principles piece does have a forward-looking aspect to it. So it does think about the new investments that will take place, but it's relatively limited. So again, if you're coming from a highly fossil fuel intensive grid, you're not necessarily going to have access to a lot of these funds. And yet in the African case, it's absolutely clear, and next slide please, it's absolutely clear that investment in new grids releases releases not just the potential for investment in more renewables, but also allows for a more efficient system. So you can end up trading, even if you don't invest in new renewables, you end up trading and you reduce the emissions from that system. So at the Climate Compatible Growth Program, together with GGI and others, we've been developing a very simple model that models every single country in the world and any potential grid line interconnectors between them. And we're able to simulate some of these, the effects of some of these interconnectors. And one of the things we've been working on together with the African Development Bank is the Caesar-Bonner set of interconnectors. So between Zambia, Botswana, and Zimbabwe and Namibia. And the thing is putting these interconnectors in place, it's complicated from a funding point of view, because if you put an interconnector in place, you're not necessarily going to reduce or increase emissions. You're going to increase electricity trade, right? But what we can show with this modeling very, very transparently, it's all open source, auditable, and so on, is that overall emissions go down. And so we can put this in place. We show emissions go down. And we can have a look at these different taxonomies and things we could do to relax the rules for those taxonomies in order to make some of those grid investments possible. And so there are three takeaway messages from this. So next slide, please. So number one, investments in grids in emerging and developing economies are just a really powerful prerequisite and potential for new investments in renewables and trade. This is important. The next message is that our current taxonomies and rules limit the amount of finance that we can release for certain types of donor agencies. If we relax those rules, and one example of how we could relax those rules is by looking at the country's ambition going into the future, it's the case that we could release a lot more financing. The next point is that with modeling, we can do this very transparently and have a robust, quantified discussion with the countries involved. And the last example, we can see exactly what the changes in trade would be between different countries. We can map those to investment strategies in those countries, and we can have a look at the net reduction in emissions and, importantly, the improvement in economic performance. And allied to that is that many funds are perhaps not as tied to the criteria that are there. So, for example, GCF funds, green bond funds, and others just need to see information about what the carbon additionality is. And these tools and processes that are being put in place under the Green Grids Initiative allow us to perhaps look at that and make an economic and financial case just much, much faster. So please do watch this space, and please feel free to be in contact and so on as we try and navigate this. You saw the number earlier on, $400 million, and that's a low case, all with net climate benefits and reductions in system costs. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mark. Now, Daniel, would you like to come up and talk through your slides for us? Thank you.
Right. It's always difficult to speak after Mark, who so eloquently explained a lot of the issues that I was also about to touch upon. My name is Daniel Schroth. I'm the Director in charge of renewable energy and energy efficiency at the African Development Bank, and it's really a pleasure being at the end of a long energy day in the UK Pavilion for a very important topic around the Global Green Grids Initiative. And I would like to zoom in a bit on the African context. If we can just go to the next slide, please. Just to highlight, and Mark alluded to it, obviously regional integration is a key factor in the African context. It allows, obviously, to harness the different resource potentials across the continent, whether that's, for example, large hydropower potential in Central Africa, whether that's obviously solar across the entire zone of the Sahel, in Namibia and other parts of the continent, wind energy inland, but also in many of the coastal areas. So there's a lot of complementarities that can be harnessed if we emphasize and pursue the regional integration agenda. That's very much in line with the political objective of the African single electricity market, which is sort of the ambition and the goal that Africa and African institutions have, very much aligned also with the African continental free trade area. Just one figure that I would like to highlight here, which is from the recent International Energy Agency 2022 Africa Energy Outlook, which sort of gives an idea of the scale of investment that is required. It sort of indicates that sort of for the second half of this decade, around $10 billion will be required on an annual basis in investments in grids in Africa. And that's sort of more than 3 times sort of the current level of investment. So it's very clear that we need to do collectively more in terms of bringing more finance towards grids. And that obviously also includes the critical question of how we can channel climate finance into this area. Just to highlight, I think as well, and we of course are very much aware of the debt sustainability issues, particularly in many African countries. A lot of these investments will still be public sector, but the public sector alone will not be able to invest at that level. And that's sort of really where we need sort of to start looking into where can the private sector also play a role on transmission. If we can go to the next slide, please. I'm not going to go into detail, but I just would like to highlight that there clearly is an urgency in the African context. These are sort of some statistics from a report that we released last year together with the World Bank around utility performance indicators called Upbeat, although the results are not that upbeat. Just to highlight, if you see here, one figure is indicating how sort of the losses in the networks have actually grown over the last couple of years and sort of representing here 15%. So that's very significant and clearly underlines that when we talk about grid investments, we also need to see how we can address the situation of the public utilities. Next slide, please. Again, not going into detail here, but it's sort of a little bit of a conflicting message here. From the analysis is that we see a number of utilities that actually do publish their reports that there's a low financial gearing level. That would sort of kind of seem to imply that private sector investment could come in. But obviously, a lot of these utilities still rely on the sovereign balance sheets. And again, sort of with the whole debt sustainability situation, that is not sort of a sustainable solution. We can go to the next slide. Africa has placed regional integration very high on the agenda for a number of years, and I think many of you will be familiar with some of the key continental programs. One is the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa, which was an exercise done in collaboration with the continental African institutions and the various power pools, sort of trying to identify what are critical investment projects in the infrastructure sector, including in the power sector, and many of these priority projects were in fact transmission corridors connecting the different power pools of the continent. This work is currently being expanded in the context of the Continental Transmission Master Plan, which is a very large exercise that is trying to identify what are sort of the critical transmission bottlenecks that need to be addressed sort of to realize the vision of the African single electricity market. Next slide, please. Again, not going to go into detail, but this is just to give a little bit of an idea of the work on the Continental Power System Master Plan. There's a lot of work going on in terms of modeling the various inputs and outputs. It's a cooperation with many partners that are involved, IRENA, International Atomic Energy Agency, funding from the European Commission, from the African Development Bank, and sort of coordinated by the African Union Development Agency and the African Union Commission. Next slide. Now, let me just sort of go a little bit more into the Global Green Grids Initiative. And the approach from our side has been, this is a global initiative, but it's very important that this global initiative is sort of anchored very firmly on sort of regional leadership. And this is why from our side, from the African Development Bank side, we early on kind of said it's important that we create sort of an African working group of this global initiative. And we were able to secure early on a mandate from the African Union, formally adopted by the ministers sort of for that working group. We also placed a very strong emphasis from the get-go that we said we don't want to replicate, we want to accelerate. We sort of want to build on the work that's already ongoing, whether that's PIDA, whether it's Continental Transmission Master Plan, also welcoming Crispin from Oda Nepad as a close partner here. The second thing that we did is we looked at the projects that have already been prioritized in the African context. For example, I mentioned the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa, PIDA. There are a number of transmission projects that have been prioritized in that context. So we discussed with the working group that brings together African institutions, but also many partners, sort of to see which of these transmission projects are sort of the most impactful from an energy transition perspective. So we agreed on a methodology, we analyzed these projects according to the methodology, and the result was that there were 2 transmission projects already prioritized that sort of scored very highly from the transmission, from the energy transition angle. One is the Sisabona project that Mark referred to earlier, sort of really interconnecting from west to east southern Africa. So that's clearly an effort that we're sort of working on promoting together with the Southern African Power Pool. Another project was really a sort of Central Africa, Southern Africa interconnection linked to the great hydropower potential in DRC, which is the Inga 3 interconnector. If we can go to the next slide. This is just sort of to highlight sort of what we've been doing sort of in Sisabona, which is sort of a little bit of proof of concept opportunity from our perspective. We have feasibility studies that were done a few years ago, but it's also been very clear that these feasibility studies that were done at the time did not fully take into account some of the potential that is sort of available in the Southern African context. Here, particular, would like to highlight the tremendous solar potential in Botswana and Namibia, which is also sort of being pushed and promoted in the context of the Mega Solar Initiative, but also, of course, sort of the interlinkage between that solar potential and the hydro potential that exists in the Southern African context. Here, for example, at the Batoka Gorge hydropower plant. We have been working with the climate compatible growth program, Mark and his team, sort of trying to really firm up the analysis, sort of to make the case, which is also going to be critical for mobilizing climate finance. From the African Development Bank side, we're mobilizing technical assistance resources to help undertake some of that preparatory work that will then allow to have the financing move in subsequently. If we can move to the next slide, and I know I'm rushing slightly through these slides, but just a couple of concluding thoughts. The first one is, for these interconnections, for these projects that involve many countries, political support is quintessential. It's very critical that you have the political backing and the political support in the countries concerned. We have highlighted the Sisabona project as sort of a first proof of concept of the Global Green Grids initiative in the African context, and also from the perspective of using that analysis sort of to unlock the climate finance that is going to be critical. We have also, just to highlight, been focusing from the beginning sort of to make sure that there is a linkage and connection to the work that is ongoing on the Continental Transmission Master Plan. So there will be certainly additional priorities coming out of this work that is currently ongoing. So clearly it's not just these 2 initially prioritized transmission interconnections that the focus should be on. There will be additional ones based on the analysis currently ongoing. And obviously, just to conclude, what will be very critical is that we can sort of mobilize sort of the partnership, the different stakeholders that are required, whether that's the political side, whether that's the regulators, whether that's the other development partners, and of course sort of the technical experts that are required to help make the case. With that, I would like to thank you and of course available for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Now to our final panelists. Hong Peng, if you want to come up and talk us through your slides.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to have this opportunity to share about what's going on in Asia Pacific, especially on the GGI. Next slide. Go ahead. Yeah, I just want to share with you, I come from the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and Pacific. and which is one of the 5 UN regional commissions based in Bangkok. We are looking after 53 members and 9 associate members. So this is really a very dynamic kind of region. And if you look at the energy situation, there are quite a lot of countries and with sufficient energy supply, but there are also countries depend on imported fossil fuels at the moment. Still, we have 126 million of population without access to electricity. And also there are small island states which really need a lot of this energy supply. So next slide, please. So we are joining this GGI initiative to support through establishing this expert working group, because we think this is really along the priorities we are doing in Asia Pacific. So the last year, our member states just adopted a regional roadmap for power grid connectivity, which include 9 strategies with the 4 categories from planning, financing and development operations, and also cross-cutting issues, which include 9 strategies. I will not go through the details, but this GGI is actually quite synchronized with what we are thinking, and also the member country gave us the mandate to move forward to support the power grid connectivity in Asia Pacific. Next slide, please. So if you look at this Asia Pacific this Asia Pacific working group, actually under our energy committee in ASCAP, we have a dedicated expert working group on energy connectivity. So we think this is also good to connect our existing institutional mechanism to support the implementation of the GGI concept. And we also mobilize a number of other agencies to join us to support this working group. We have the members from the Asian Development Bank, and also from ASEAN Center for Energy. We also have the members from different countries like Australia government, and also we have the National Grid from UK, and also we have SARC Energy Center and Sun Cable. A number of these stakeholders involved in this in this working group to support the implementation, at least to merge with the ongoing kind of efforts and the initiative in Asia Pacific. Compared to what Daniel shared about Africa, we feel in Asia Pacific we lag behind in terms of the power grid connectivity. So there's no kind of real regional power trade, cross-border power trade existing in Asia Pacific. Mostly it's just bilateral, between the neighboring countries. We don't have a multilateral electricity trade agreement, and we see the progress this year. There are ASEAN, 4 countries in ASEAN: Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, and Laos. They actually signed the first cross-border multilateral electricity trade, and to import hydroelectricity from Laos through Thailand and Malaysia to Singapore. So we see this is a great kind of step forward, but we need more this kind of effort. And we also see this is one of the effective way to integrate more renewables through cross-border power grid connectivity. As you know, a lot of resources, especially from renewable energy, it's far away from the load center. So through this power grid connectivity, you can just integrate more renewables from even one country to another. So that's mainly to increase this kind of share of renewables into the power grid. For example, in ASEAN, they have the very, very well developed ASEAN Master Plan for Power Grid Connectivity, but the implementation part, it still takes a lot of time. And also ASEAN set up this 23% of renewable energy by 2025. But actually this power grid connectivity master plan didn't really link with how this power sector can contribute to achieve this 23% of renewables in the energy mix. So if you link this, I think one way is to integrate more renewables into this ASEAN power grid to have more multilateral electricity trade. That will help the ASEAN to achieve its renewable energy goal by 2025. So next slide, please. So this is actually the principles under this task force, how we support and the different stakeholders to move forward and to develop a set of standard principles. I think this is very important before we start to work together. And in addition to political will, a lot of standard and principles we need to mobilize and to agree on it to develop a framework which will provide the guidance to move forward for these interconnections. And also the activities it's ongoing under this working group is to develop the analysis of connectors of life cycle, and also development of draft principles. As I said, that principles will provide the guidance and framework for future connections. And also the dissemination among different kind of countries. Actually, in Asia Pacific, there are quite a number of countries interested in the power grid connectivity and also develop multilateral agreement. But some of the countries actually lack of capacity. They clearly say we want to get support from like international organizations like UNESCAP to provide this kind of opportunity to exchange information among the members. They have successful kind of experiences to develop this kind develop or formulate this kind of multilateral power purchase agreement and also cross-border connectivity. So that is where it's really one of the tasks we think under this Green Grid initiative. We will also provide an opportunity to support member countries for this. Next slide, please. And also at the same time, we also have the request from small island countries, because in our intergovernmental meeting, a lot of Pacific countries said, you have this cross-border power grid connectivity, but how the Pacific country can do it? Because a lot of island, even not on the Pacific Island country, like from Southeast Asia, Philippines, and Indonesia, they are island country. They have over 1,000, even several thousand islands for the country. So they said, how we just build up, even within the country, the power grid connectivity. What will be the policies? How the government support? Where the investment come from? So that's exactly we think this kind of GGI initiative also provide a good opportunity for us to work with this island country and to think about how you just make your existing national grid stronger, and secondly, how to just improve your transmission lines and through these connectivities to those different islands. But of course, there are some islands, probably there's no reason to connect with the national grid, but they need to build their own grid. But that's also same thing, how you link it with the integration of renewables with this isolated power grid. So that's where we think we will work together with those island countries and no one left behind. So that's exactly we want to work to make sure those island countries and also island itself will be part of this connectivity initiative. Next slide, please. And also, if you look at what Daniel and Mark mentioned about the financing for power grid connectivity, that's a major challenge in Asia Pacific with a lot of developing countries, especially under this COVID pandemic. The recovery needs a lot of investment, and which actually squeezes the public financing space to support the energy transition. Power grid is one of it. So how to support this power grid investment, because the transmission lines always need a huge investment. So that's where we also look at to work with the different stakeholders and the private sector to build up this kind of enabling environment. And recently, actually, we organized the Asia Pacific Financing for Climate Actions. One of the sessions is specifically focused on the green grid, how you just mobilize financing and who are the potential financiers. So that's, we also bring this compendium. Actually, we consolidate the compendium and bring it here for the financing day. And afterwards, I think GFAN, the Glasgow Financing Group, they will just continue and to find what will be the good solutions from the financing part. So, next slide, please. I just want to stop here, and in conclusion, I really think the Green Grid initiative is one of the good initiative which will promote energy transition by integrating more renewables through power grid connectivity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone, for your brilliant slides. We've probably got about 5 minutes, so I don't know if anybody has any questions they want to put to three speakers. Right, I think we've got a mic coming over. Sorry, I've sprung this on you. There's a question there, and there's a question at the back over there as well.
Hi, it's Graham Maidment from the UK government. Can you hear me okay? Yeah.
I think hold it up and closer.
Okay, it's Graham Maidment from the UK government. Fantastic, really interesting presentation. Love the optimisation of the grid. I just wonder if you'd looked at the demand market a bit more, and particularly in Africa. You mentioned about mining, but there's a big demand for food, and there's quite a lot of work which we're funding on food cooling hubs. There's a project which we fund called ACES, which is the African Centre for Sustainable Cooling, and they're looking at trying to work out where the cooling hubs should be to optimise or to minimise waste, but to connect them to distribution lines, so roads as well. It'd be great to work that into your modelling somehow, so that you optimise it from an energy, so it becomes an energy food nexus as well. So it could be really interesting.
So just a quick response to that. Absolutely. And so I mentioned mining because of its very direct link with the energy transition everywhere. And, you know, I think there's a very strong argument to talk about making sure that your overall footprint is zero. But yeah, we certainly see an increase in cooling as being incredibly important, as well as a potential increase in the use of electric vehicles, 2- and 3-wheelers and buses and so on. But indeed, it would be very nice to connect up to start to put together sensible pictures. And one of the things that's lovely about the mining space as well as the cooling space and the EV space is that, you know, these can be linked to productive uses and, you know, developing national economies in a way that's inclusive. And we hear a lot about a just transition, and sometimes I think we get locked into this argument about just stop the coal-fired power plants, whereas actually there's a whole lot of really interesting value propositions that could come along, and would love to connect. But I'm sure from the African perspective there are a whole bunch of things that would be useful to bring up. Daniel.
No, well, absolutely. First of all, I concur with what Mark said. And clearly, just maybe two points. One is, obviously, there's an energy agriculture nexus. Africa also wants sort of to move away from sort of just basically being reliant on food imports, but being self-sufficient. And in fact, Africa has the potential to supply food to many areas outside of the continent as well. So that requires also better mechanization, better irrigation. A lot of that can be powered with solar, for example. So there are a number of pilot projects that are ongoing. Plus also sort of having sort of larger scale production of agricultural products. We, for example, have a program that's called the Special Agro-Processing Zones, where we're working with a number of African countries on large-scale production of food products, and of course, providing the energy required is sort of critical, whether that's through the grid or through decentralized distributed energy systems. So it's really both.
only got a few more minutes, but I know there was a question over there, and then after that, I'm gonna close the session. Do you want to come in?
Hi, Simon Sharp from the Climate Champions team. Want to thank everybody for this. There's such a good panel. This is going to be one of my highlights of COP27, definitely. A question for Mark was about how much are you seeing the business case for interconnectors change over time as the technology improves? I think Daniel referred to revisiting some previous feasibility studies. When you do that, do you see that the case for them now is much stronger than they were before? And if I can, a quick question for Daniel as well. How much of a difference does it make politically when you identify two specific projects as priorities from among a very large master plan with lots and lots of projects? Thanks.
I think that's an excellent question, by the way, and it may well be interesting to bring in some of Hong Peng's experience as well. I mean, the drivers for these interconnectors in Asia is just the scene has changed. All of a sudden, there are demand centers and low-cost supply centers. So a couple of weeks ago, together with Marcus and a few others, we were looking at the business case for some of these interconnectors and wrapping them into large-scale solar investments and so on. And actually, it's super interesting because it's possible to start thinking about, you know, a kind of integrated project around large solar and interconnectors through to client countries. And there are a lot of interesting hoops to jump through, which can be facilitated by things like the Southern African Power Pool and various initiatives that are ongoing with the African Development Bank. But it is just very interesting. You can land solar power, for example, from the region into South Africa, which is currently an important demand hub, at much lower prices than were previously thought possible. And the idea of integrating some of the solar with some of the hydro resources to do the balancing, to provide 24/7 low-cost power into a country that desperately needs it, just changes the dynamic. And I think that's really interesting. And unpacking that into something that is friendly for the technology developers, friendly for the project developers, and has a really good value proposition for the utilities and the countries involved. I think there's something quite special there that needs to be explored. And this goes beyond, mention was made of, for example, difficulty with respect to the financial viability of a lot of utilities. But in actual fact, this may transform itself into a bit of a rescue package. If you can think of low-cost generation in one area going to a major demand hub with off-takers that will get electricity for cheaper than they can generate, and there may be some conditions with respect to the price that is resold at. These are potential revenue generators for the utilities along the way, which could help unlock some of the problems that we have associated with the liquidity of those generators. So, you know, if you think a little bit bigger than we have been thinking, I think there are really, really interesting potential opportunities. And just the argument for making those utilities liquid alone is really strong, because then we can look to unlocking some of these distributed generation options, other options that are often locked because you can't get you can't crowd in finance because the central organization that's at the heart of this is struggling financially. So I think there's a lot of interesting opportunity. And, you know, I think there's action on the ground as well. And this is why I mentioned Hong Peng and the Asia Pacific. I mean, we see that there is demand to start signing these agreements to get regional trade up and running. The economic case is strong. And I think the project development business case is potentially really strong, as well as some of the on-the-ground business models that can result are strong as well. But synthesizing that into something that is easily communicated is something that we're looking for champions to do.
So we've run over time, but Daniel, Hong Peng, I want to give you a minute each just to see whether you can round us out.
Sure. Just very quickly to the second question, and it's a very good one. I would like to answer with 3 points. First, the projects that we have sort of identified at this point in time are already continentally approved prioritized projects, so they come from a list of projects that were endorsed, in fact, by the African heads of state. Secondly, or kind of the second point I would like to make in that regard is that we've said from the beginning that these are the two initial projects, but obviously we will look at other projects as well, particularly those that sort of come out of the ongoing work that colleagues from ODA, NEPAD and others are leading on the Continental Transmission Master Plan. So it's not kind of one region versus another. It just happened to be that based on the criteria that we established and agreed as a working group, the two projects identified are sort of in the Southern African Power Pool. In fact, the second one is sort of linking the Southern African Power Pool also with the Central African Power Pool. So it goes a bit beyond that. But this is sort of how I would answer it, but I recognize that it can be politically sensitive, and this is sort of why we need to emphasize this is just the starting point. It does not mean that there are key priority projects in East, in West, and in Northern Africa.
Very finally.
Thank you. I just want to add, actually, power grid connectivity will benefit the local people. You know, a lot of these kind of examples through this kind of connectivity, they even establish a kind of social development fund. For example, the CASA 1000 is in Central Asia, from Central Asia to South Asia, but then the social development fund is, support the local communities. They may not just get electricity from this transmission line, but they get the financial support for the local community development initiative. So I see this is a social impact, the social benefits through this power grid connectivity, and the people will have this kind of opportunity to improve their living conditions. That's really one of the benefits we can think, in addition to renewable energy, scale up renewable energy. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the questions. I'm going to close the session and say thank you to our speakers. You've had brilliant feedback, one of the best sessions that somebody over there has been in, so thank you very much. I was asked to flag the Bangkok event we have on the Asia Pacific GGI in December. So Marcus, sitting straight there, will have more information if you want to find out about it. And I was going to leave you with a final comment where I started, that I think this session has proved that there is no transition without transmission.